Notacon.
So my name is Radman. I founded an art group called Acid, or NC Creators in Demand, about 15 years ago in September 1990. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about that. The name of the speech is called Steering an Art Collective. So yeah, I'm basically going to talk about what it was like to run Acid for 14 years, what prompted me to do that, and maybe share a few stories. Basically what happened, the way Acid was formed, was I was in the BBSing scene in the late 80s. I joined up in a group because in the late 80s and the 90s, it was the big thing to do was join a group. You had to be in a group to get on a board. They would ask, what are your affiliations? You know, and you'd have to name up all your affiliations. And if you couldn't get into a group, then you would, basically you'd form your own group. So the first group that I formed actually was a hacker group called HEAT, which of course had an acronym stood for Hackers Enterprising Across Telecommunications. We released one magazine and lost to time. And then I started to see really cool ANSI art on some of the BBSs by a group called Aces of ANSI Art. So I downloaded the draw, tried it out. I created a logo for my hacker group called HEAT, and submitted it to them and was accepted. And after a few months being in the group, we kind of I started to recruit other members into the group, started calling out other boards within Northern America, Canada, the East Coast, California, everywhere in between, and basically started growing the group into more than what it initially was, which was mostly a California-based group, or mostly a Northern California-based group with a few exceptions. So after a while of doing that, a couple things happened by accident or not. What ended up happening in Aces of ANSI Art was the board, in order to become more elite, locked out all the local callers to the bulletin board. So this was kind of a way of signifying, we're so fucking cool, we're only going to accept people on our board that are from out of state or out of our area, who are probably freaking to get here, or who are having to pay a long distance toll charge in order to call this BBS. We don't want local lamers, so that's what they did. And by doing that, they ended up locking out a significant chunk of the members of the group that they were headquarters for on this particular bulletin board, which was called Nuclear Wasteland. Now, looking back, I mean, I'm still actually in touch with the SysUp of this bulletin board, and so, it might be revisionism here, but he contends that, that was an accident, or that wasn't necessarily meant to be that way, but, it was an oversight or something like that. But, we didn't see it that way. We're all teenagers, so we're like, oh, fuck you, we're going to go start our own group then. This is the last straw, we're doing everything for this group, so we're going to start our own. And so I started speaking with some of the members that I had recruited into Aces of ANSI Art and said, okay, we need to go start our own crew. And so we threw some names around. Acid came out, and then the backronym for that was NC Creators in Demand. So we started that. We recruited all the people that initially got into AA and started the group from there. So when we first started the group, we were 5 members. We had 4 artists and 1 SysUp. It was myself, Shadow Demon, Grim, the Beholder, and Phantom, who was the SysUp of our world headquarters. He was the first bulletin board to distribute Acid ANSI artwork. And from there, we just kind of continued to grow and do the same things that I would basically do the same things that I was doing in Aces of ANSI Art, which was calling around, looking for talent, basically being a talent scout for the group, promoting the group, and such. And I think it was between 1990, from 1990 to 1996, we grew from 5 active members to 144 concurrently active members. So I can illustrate that here. This is actually a 1991 member list. I don't have a pretty one to show on the screen from 1990. You can basically just axe, these two guys and add in Phantom versus Scizop. Let's see here. This is the member list at the close of '96, and it's significantly longer. And you see that it's gone from just artists to a number of different subdivisions. We have an advisory staff, we have secretaries, and then of course artists, which is the core of the group. Musicians, coders, BBS modifications. So these were people who took enhancements of a bulletin board system one step further. So instead of just doing ANSI art to make the bulletin board look nicer, they would actually code different features into the BBS and then release them to the public so everybody could have these extra features. So these are called BBS mods. We had an AIS division, which was, at this time, we were starting to make our foray into the internet by '96. So we had a division specifically for that. Telecom couriers. Now this is kind of an interesting division. This started off, we first had our first courier division in 1993, an official division. I'm sorry, excuse me, that was actually telecom division, started in 1993. Courier was a little bit earlier than that. But the reason that we formed these two divisions, the first one was the courier division, was for the express purpose of making sure that our artwork and our art packs were spread out to all the other bulletin boards in the world. So their job was to take our art and make sure it was populated everywhere else, because there was no, at the time, there was no real way, nobody had internet connections or anything like that. So you'd have to manually call up a board, send the file to this person, and then hang up from that board and call the next board and so on. And that was pretty costly to do. So we had members recruited that couldn't necessarily draw that would specifically do that. And then the telecom division, their job was basically communications, to make sure that we had the ability to talk to everybody, because we were quickly growing from a North American group to a global group, and that required a lot of costly phone calls. So their job was to find a way to make those phone calls one way or another. So this member list is kind of going forward a lot. It wasn't for a few years that we started to get into music and other divisions. Let me see here. I mentioned art packs. What those were, basically, in 1992, we had gotten to a point where we had so much artwork to upload manually one at a time to all these different bulletin boards that we needed a method in which to send all of this art more efficiently. And so rather than upload each individual piece of art one at a time, somebody suggested, well, why don't you just zip it up? That would make a lot more sense than uploading all these files one at a time and then describing them and entering a one-line description for each one. Just to make an archive. And yeah, that's so stupidly obvious. Why didn't we do that in the first place? So, but a really interesting thing happened. We created the first art pack a few months prior to June, and then we started just basically doing it on a monthly basis, starting with the June '92 pack. And what this other ANSI art groups out there saw this, and they started to do the same thing. And what this led to basically was a monthly competition. So, I mean, it sounds kind of funny that you're competing in the field of art, but when you take, again, if you have teenagers involved, there's, the competitive nature, inherent nature of teenagers are there. So we would release an art pack one month, and then a competing art group such as ICE or Mirage would release an art pack in response to this. And then so we'd have basically these groups competing to put out the most art or the best art, and there were certain times where a group wouldn't be able to meet. One group would do 40 and the other one would do 35, so they'd say, oh, we won. And then they'd have to say something else like, yeah, but we're having quality over quantity, ours is better quality than yours, and this and that. So that went on. Let's see, we released those on the first of every month, and that was a pretty big deal to have the packs released on time. We had a really strict schedule, and in order to in order to meet these deadlines, the telecom division of ACID came in very handy. We would schedule what were called Alliance teleconferences, and basically that would bring together all of the members of ACID at once onto the calls, and we could just basically would have like 30 people on the phone together speaking all at the same time, and these conferences wouldn't just be like a 1 hour conference. These conferences could go on for like 2-3 days straight. And what's that? Yeah, on the telephone. It was to the point where I could, if you had a dedicated line, you could basically go to school that morning and then leave the phone off the hook, come back when you got home from school at 3:30 or 4 o'clock or whatever, pick it up, and people would still be there from different parts of the world talking about really anything. A lot of the times it had nothing to do with, underground VBSs or ANSI art or anything like that. It was just, they're just BSing with each other, and just kind of, building a camaraderie and stuff like that. So another interesting thing about the ACID teleconferences were the way in which we brought people in. One of our best artists was named Jed, and he was very famous for doing his ANSI animations. But he was never on an ACID conference. He was kind of like this enigma that nobody ever knew, who he was or what he sounded like or anything like that. And the reason for this was because he had the voice of like, he was recruited into ACID, I think, at the age of like 11 or 12, which is really astounding because he's probably the best ANSI animator ever. And you can imagine, if you haven't yet gone through puberty or anything like that, the pitch of your voice is very high, and other kids in the group, because basically we're all kids in our teens, they could be very judgmental, and this could get around, Jed has this high-pitched voice or something like that. So he was never brought into the conferences. And then another thing that we would do is we would actually stack the order in how we'd bring people into the calls. So a big problem when you have 30 teenagers on the phone is moderating a discussion if you actually need to get something done. So the first thing that we would do is we'd bring in the senior members of the group and talk about whatever whatever the business was that needed to be taken care of. And then we would gradually bring in more members into this discussion until finally we'd bring everybody in. And there was a couple people on the fray that we always knew basically were the ones that eventually, as soon as we added them, there was about 10 minutes left of this being a really productive conference, and then it's just going to turn to hell, and people will start doing prank calls and things like this, which were like a pretty normal thing for the conferences. Let's see. Just looking at other things. Eventually, in ACID, we built a reputation for ourselves as far as being an ANSI group, and it was kind of like a double-edged sword, because we were recognized as the best or one of the two best ANSI groups in the world. And in the last 15 years, there have been over 450 ANSI groups. ACID is probably the second one ever to be created. The first that there's a record of is Aces of ANSI Art. So since Aces of ANSI Art and then ACID, there's been this lineage of 450 groups, and each group could be as small as 2 people, or it could be as big as ACID. There's a very small handful of groups that have had multiple hundreds of members. But the double-edged sword for being recognized as this ANSI group was we wanted to expand into other mediums, because we saw ANSI as something that may not be around forever. We wanted to expand into high-resolution arts, because this is kind of a blocky art that's limited to a bulletin board system. We wanted to get into other artistic things such as music and so on. So we started a music division, and a lot of our musicians, it was difficult basically to get a musician to join the group, because they're like, well, you're an ANSI group, what are you doing? And so in order to kind of deal with that, we started spinning off subsidiary groups. One was called Fluid. Then later on we started another group called